Hey everyone, today's the 76th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It's been a long time, longer than most of you watching this have probably been alive. I know it's well over twice as long as I've been alive. But anyway, let's take a moment to remember what happened that day. Thousands of people died. About 2,000, well over 2,000 U.S. sailors were killed, and Marines and soldiers were killed that day. And they died defending our country. And a little over another 1,000, more than that, were wounded. Some of them very grievously. And we need to take a moment and just say, thank you for everything you've done for us. I mean, it's the only reason we're not speaking Japanese and eating sushi right and sauerkraut right now. Those guys are the reason why we are not eating sushi, sauerkraut, and going to school 8 hours a day. Okay. Anyway, it's the attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical success. It really was. I mean, they sunk 4 U.S. battleships and damaged another 4. They also damaged 4 cruisers, and a number of other ships. And they also destroyed and damaged about roughly 300 planes. And for a loss of only about 5 midget submarines and 29 aircraft. Now, on the surface, that's a pretty good trade-off. However, strategically it wasn't. And I will go into that in a minute. But before we get into that, let's explain what happened on that terrible day that woke the sleeping giant. 6 Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shukaku, and Zukaku, set off from Japan, and after a voyage, which was probably pretty long for the crews on board, they sent hundreds of their warplanes into Hawaii, more specifically at Oahu, and even more specifically Pearl Harbor. And they did a shit ton of damage and killed a lot of people. And the reality is that even though the figures I just listed were impressive, they didn't do the damage Yamamoto wanted to do. They missed very key targets. And no, I'm not talking about the carriers. I'm not. First of which is probably the oil reserves. If those things had been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would probably have not been able to run for about, I think it was 10 months. It would have been landlocked and docked for about 10 months or more. I know it was Chester Nimitz who said something about that. But anyway, another important target that was missed was the submarine pens. Those submarines, they don't get the glory that battleships and aircraft carriers do, but they're very important. They're a very important aspect of naval warfare, and they sank a lot of Japanese and German ship, and well, Germans didn't really have to ship much overseas, but they did a lot of damage. The Japanese, the American submarines went on to sink about just a whole bunch of tonnage. They were second only to the Germans. And, the Japanese lost a lot of shipping to the submarines, and they also lost a lot of shipping. They also lost one of their aircraft aircraft carriers. Well, actually, two aircraft carriers: the Shukaku and later, and the Tahoe at the Philippine Sea. And anyway, the submarines were pretty bad. Another thing they could have hit, another option was the shipyards, which might have been easy to repair, but you need those shipyards. And the battleships were not really that important. They were big, slow ships that really couldn't keep up with the rest of the fleet. That being said, is that they're the only thing they were really good for in the days of the aircraft carrier are shore bombardment. And but back in that time, they were considered to be the principal weapon of war. It's like if you just watch the movie Tora Tora Tora, and there was this one guy who goes, okay, this Japanese guy in the Imperial Japanese Navy who's like, there are many officers who support the idea that battleships still reign supreme. I am one of them. And I thought to myself, okay, here we have a typical case of a general, or in this case, an admiral fighting the last war. And then he goes, we will have 2 unsinkable battleships with a displacement of 60,000 tons, complete with huge guns. And I thought to myself, okay, we don't have a case of an admiral fighting the last war. We got a case of a Kool-Aid drinker here. Anyway, in short, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the planes that were destroyed there, they could easily be replaced. That being said, with all that being said, in short, to make a long story short, the attack on Pearl Harbor didn't do anything but piss America off really badly. And it woke the sleeping giant, and he was very cranky. What happened with Japan is that they made a very critical error. They believed that with their warrior spirit and their willingness to die, that they could overcome America's industrial might. However, what we have seen through numerous examples in history is that when warriors go to war with industrialists win. That has been proven quite a few times before. And not just in World War II being a prime example. It was proven in the American Civil War. It was proven numerous times in the American Indian Wars. The same thing goes with the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s. For the war that the British had with the Gurkhas in Nepal. There was also the Anglo-Zulu War, and the wars the French had in Africa as well. I can't pronounce the kingdom of that name, but it had the Darthmian Amazons or something like that. Yeah, that was another example of industrialists prevailing over warriors. And it's just the reason why industrialists went out over warriors in war is for people, a lot more people, because they need all the people to keep their industry and their agricultural pursuits going. Warrior societies, they tend to be overtly focused on quality over quantity, and sometimes you just need more people. 10 of the strongest men in the world are not going to be able to, push a really big boulder or something. You'd need like 100 people pulling or pushing on it. That being said, is another reason is warrior societies tend to be too focused on old school tradition Like, the Japanese with their swords and their bushido and their seppuku and all that stuff. It's just, they often don't adapt quickly enough. Industrialized societies, they're always going forward, always progressing, and they come up with newer and better technology. Another reason is that modern wars, conventional wars at least, are won in the factory, not on the battlefield. If you can produce soldiers and men and equipment faster than your opponent can kill them, can just kill or destroy them, you pretty much won the war. Again, as long as it's conventional and doesn't go guerrilla. That being said, is after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese took out took Malaya and the Philippines from the British and the Americans, and huge both lost huge amounts of troops during this mass surrenders there. However, once there was also Wake Island where a few Marines held off the Japanese for a good while. In fact, they had two invasions. The first of Wake Island. The first one was a failure. That was the first and only time in World War II that anyone ever turned back an amphibious force from a beachhead. So, congrats to them. And I salute them. You know what I mean? But anyway, moving on. What we see here is like at Midway, and a lot of it at that when you get to Midway, after the Coral Sea, of course, which sent one U.S. carrier to the bottom of the Pacific and two Japanese carriers to the into the repair shop, is that it was a tactical victory, I guess, for the Japanese, but a strategic victory for the Americans. As Sun Tzu said, strategy without tactics is the slowest way to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And anyway, what happened after that is there was Midway. And what's really amazing about that battle is how much of it was won by dumb luck. I mean, the dive bombers got lost, and then a few things happened, and eventually they stumble upon the Japanese fleet, and they blew the shit out of it. And they sunk 3 carriers, and granted, there was still one left, and they later got it. But this was after numerous unsuccessful attacks. This was after a really unsuccessful attack by the torpedo bombers. They didn't even get their torpedoes off, and they were all destroyed. And that was really a terrible sacrifice. But they delayed the Japanese by about 45 minutes. And if the Japanese under Nagumo had gotten those planes off the decks of those aircraft carriers, it would have been disastrous. But at the end of the day, the Japanese, they say it was a deciding battle. They say Midway was the decisive U.S. victory of the Pacific War, but in reality, it wasn't. Japan was pretty much fucked on December 7th, 1941, the second the first bomb dropped. Because they had totally inferior industry. They had something like about 3.5% of the world's industry. The U.S. had about 41% of the total world's industry. I mean, how can you match that? The U.S. had way more people, had way more advanced weapons for the most part, and better logistics. And even if the U.S. had lost catastrophically at Midway, with like all 3 of its carriers sunk and the island of Midway taken, the U.S. still had a bunch of really awesome, kick-ass Essex class carriers on the way. Those things would have been a nightmare for Japan. Japan's another thing about Japan is that in the early stages of the war, they had really, really good pilots. I mean, you had to get something like for an army pilot to get into army aviation, you had to have something like 500 hours, and for the Navy, it was like 700 minimum. And some of the guys at Pearl Harbor had like 3,000 flying hours, and so they were pretty good pilots. Don't let anyone tell you any different. But and I think towards the end of the war, to be a U.S. To get into aviation in the U.S., you had to have like 300 or so flying hours. But anyway, moving on. It's just, you know, what led to Pearl Harbor was the result of I think, a collective narcissism on the part of the Japanese high command. They believed that with all their, Bushido and all that stuff, that they could prevail over, these cowardly Westerners. And granted, the U.S. and British kind of underestimated the Japanese too, a lot, I think, and that led to disaster. And what I think we can learn from all this is that the World War II vets today, there's not very many of them left, and they're in their late 80s now, if not older, the ones that are still around. And I just got to say to those guys, thank you from the bottom of my heart, because you've earned, I don't know what I could do to repay you, but I owe you so much. And I really want to thank you, regardless of whether or not they fought in the European theater of operations or the Pacific theater. I mean, I'm blessed to have known some of them, and sadly, pretty much all of them have passed on. And I one former Marine who fought from the thick of the Pacific with the 2nd Marine Division and the 1st Marine Division in Korea. He told me that war movies aren't inaccurate because of what they show. They're usually inaccurate because of what they don't show. I mean, even in the Pacific, they don't capture the long waiting times that you just spend, completely miserable, with no one trying to kill you or anything exciting going on. You usually spend it cleaning, getting bit by mosquitoes and leeches, and it's just you're getting trench foot, and very rarely do people ever shoot at you. It's not something anyone would really care to put in a movie because it would be really, really boring. Another Iraq War veteran said it's pretty much, most of the time it's complete boredom, but very rarely it's just a moment of sheer terror. And I have come to realize that I've never been to war. I wanted to join the military when I was younger, but they wouldn't let me in for reasons I will not go into. And anyway, I really owe a debt of gratitude, we all do, to those guys, because they some all gave some and some gave all. I mean, even if they didn't pick up a rifle and fight and worked in a factory, I mean, they produced, they sweated, they risked their lives working around some pretty dangerous equipment, even though it wasn't exciting. And some of them died in the factories, and some of them got exposed to asbestos and all that crap and got lung cancer. Granted, you know, just because something's not cool doesn't mean it's not important, or interesting doesn't mean it's not important. And I just want to thank everyone well, pretty much everyone from that generation for everything they did for this country. And that will conclude my video. God bless you all. Bye.